There is a photograph inside the Australian War Memorial Archives taken sometime in mid-1967. It shows two officers standing over a map table at Nui Dat. One is Australian, one is American. They are both looking at the same map of Phuoc Tuy Province, and they are both pointing to completely different locations on it. Nobody recorded what they said to each other. Nobody needed to. The photograph said everything that needed to be said about the relationship between these two armies, fighting the same war, in the same country, on the same side, and operating in ways that could not have been more opposed if they had been deliberately designed to conflict. Let me bring you back to 1965, because the story doesn't start at Nui Dat. It starts at Bien Hoa, when America committed the 173rd Airborne Brigade to the defense of the Bien Hoa Air Base in 1965 and looked for support from its allies. The Australian government immediately responded. Prime Minister Robert Menzies stood in the Australian Parliament on the 29th of April 1965 and announced that an infantry battalion was to be sent to South Vietnam. That battalion was 1 RAR, the 1st Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment. They were attached to the United States 173rd Airborne Brigade and stationed in Bien Hoa Province, approximately 25 kilometers from Saigon, an area held by the Viet Cong. Wait, what? Australia, a nation of around 11 million people in 1965, sent a single infantry battalion to fight alongside the most powerful military on the planet in the most complex counterinsurgency war of the 20th century. And they were told to slot in under American command, follow American doctrine, operate on American timelines, using American methods in Asian jungle terrain that American officers had barely begun to understand. Oh, this story gets so much stranger and so much more revealing than you think, because what those Australian soldiers did over the next 6 years, the independence they carved out, the doctrine they refused to abandon, the results they produced, and the fear they put into the Viet Cong, would become one of the most studied case studies in military history. Pentagon analysts would spend years trying to understand it. American generals would criticize it publicly. And the Viet Cong, the men who knew the jungle better than any force on earth, would give the Australians a name that no American unit ever received. During their time in Vietnam, the SASR proved highly successful, with members of the regiment known to the Viet Cong as Ma Rung, or Phantoms of the Jungle, due to their stealth. Stay with me, because to understand why a relatively tiny force, operating on its own terms, produced results that a 500,000-strong American military machine could not replicate in the same country at the same time, you need to understand what happened at Bien Hoa first. And more than that, you need to understand what the Australians carried with them into that jungle. Not just their weapons, their memory, the memory of Malaya, the thing about Australian military culture that Americans never fully grasped, the fundamental difference that made full integration into United States command structures nearly impossible, wasn't about tactics alone. It was about institutional knowledge built on brutal, lived experience. While the United States Army in the early 1960s was doctrinally oriented toward large-scale conventional warfare in Europe, tank divisions facing Soviet armor across the German plains, the Australian Army had spent more than a decade fighting a very different kind of war. While assisting the British during the Malayan emergency, Australian and New Zealand military forces had gained considerable experience in jungle warfare and counterinsurgency. According to historian Paul Hamm, the United States Secretary of State Dean Rusk freely admitted to the ANZUS meeting in Canberra in May 1962 that the U.S. Armed Forces knew little about jungle warfare. Read that sentence again. The Secretary of State of the United States of America in 1962, 3 years before American ground forces landed in Vietnam in serious numbers, openly admitted that the greatest military power in the world did not know how to fight in jungle terrain. The Australians knew. They had learned it the hard way through years of patient, grinding counterinsurgency operations in the Malayan jungle, tracking communist insurgents through triple canopy rainforest, learning that patience and silence and small unit independence were the currencies that bought survival and victory in that kind of war. They'd learned it alongside British forces who had developed their own SAS, specifically for deep jungle reconnaissance. The success of the Malayan scouts not only ensured the continued existence of the SAS within the British Army, but also served as the blueprint for the Australian SASR and New Zealand SAS, then Borneo. Between 1963 and 1966, Australian SAS soldiers deployed to Borneo during the Indonesian confrontasi, where they conducted patrols in conditions that were considered among the most demanding in the world. Dense jungle, no roads, hostile terrain, and an enemy that knew the land intimately. The SAS proved itself in 1965 in the undeniable jungle war in Borneo during Indonesian confrontasi. Every lesson learned in Malaya was refined in Borneo. Patience, silence, intelligence gathering over time rather than kinetic action on instinct, the willingness to spend days inside enemy-controlled terrain, invisible, watching, learning patterns before ever pulling a trigger. So when one RAR arrived at Bien Hoa in 1965 and slotted in under the 173rd Airborne Brigade, the gap between Australian and American operational philosophy was not a minor stylistic difference. It was a chasm built from fundamentally different experiences of war. The Australian and American method of patrolling was vastly different. One RAR would move through the jungle silently and away from roads and tracks, whereas the 173rd would use noise and firepower to draw the enemy to them. Each learned something from the other, but one RAR maintained its own method of warfare. There were general differences of opinion between these two units as to the conduct of operations. The Airborne Brigade was designed for large deployments and heavy firepower, whereas one RAR, even though restructured to suit the American style, with its counterinsurgency experience in Malaya of operating individually from larger units, was unfamiliar and uncomfortable with these types of tactics. Attached to American forces, one RAR would primarily be employed in search and destroy operations using the newly developed doctrine of airmobile operations, utilizing helicopters to insert light infantry and artillery into an area of operations and to support them with aerial mobility, fire support, casualty evacuation, and resupply. The Australians watched this doctrine operate in real time throughout 1965, and what they saw confirmed what their instincts had already told them. American units helicoptered into areas loudly, swept through with large numbers of men, generated significant contact with the enemy when the enemy chose to engage, and then departed, leaving behind the same terrain, the same population, and an enemy who simply waited them out and moved back in. The concept of area domination through persistent presence, through patient intelligence gathering, through making the jungle itself feel unsafe for the enemy over months and years rather than days and weeks. This was absent from American search and destroy doctrine in any meaningful sense. Australian officers serving in those early months were watching and learning not just from the enemy, but from their allies' mistakes. They saw the firepower, they appreciated the scale, and they understood that in a conventional engagement on open ground, American doctrine would be devastatingly effective. But they also understood, from a decade of Malayan experience, that this was not a conventional war on open ground, and that doctrine designed for one type of war, applied to a fundamentally different type of war, didn't just underperform. It actively handed the enemy an advantage. One RAR's attachment to American forces had highlighted the differences between Australian and American operational methods, and Australian and American military leaders subsequently agreed that Australian combat forces should be deployed in a discrete province. That would allow the Australian Army to fight their own tactical war, independently of the United States. This was the turning point. This wasn't insubordination. This wasn't arrogance. This was a professional military assessment that reached the same conclusion from two different directions. Australian commanders who knew their men couldn't function optimally inside American command structures, and American commanders who saw enough friction to recognize that a separate area of responsibility would serve the overall Allied effort better than continued integration. Australia's Chief of Army, Lieutenant General John Wilton, was keen both to field a force that could operate independently of American forces and to provide additional troops in support of the fight against the Viet Cong. Wilton believed that deploying an Australian task force would achieve both these aims, as well as allowing Australian soldiers to fight the war according to their own doctrine and techniques. The government agreed, and the expansion of Australian forces in Vietnam to a task force was approved on the 8th of March, 1966. In April 1966, the first Australian task force was established in Phuoc Tuy Province, based at Nui Dat. The selection of Phuoc Tuy Province was itself a strategic decision. From a military point of view, the province was a suitable size for task force operations, and it had access to the sea through the port of Vung Tau, which could serve as a logistics base. The sea access mattered enormously to Australian planners. It meant they could sustain operations without being completely dependent on American logistics chains. And it meant that when American operational priorities shifted, Australians weren't left in the field without resupply. They had their own tail. But the province itself was a significant operational problem. The South Vietnamese government's authority over Phuoc Tuy was limited almost entirely to the provincial capital Ba Ria. In the countryside, the Viet Cong had built up an extensive cadre and political organization that reached into every town and village. The province's roads were dangerous, subject to ambush, and passable only with heavy escort. The Viet Cong had established bases in Phuoc Tuy's mountains and jungles. This was not a quiet backwater handed to a small Allied contingent to keep them busy while the real war happened elsewhere. Whereas the Americans relied on massed firepower and mobility in big unit search and destroy operations as part of a war of attrition which often resulted in heavy casualties on both sides, the Australians, although not eschewing conventional operations, emphasized deliberate patrolling using dispersed companies supported by artillery, armored personnel carriers, and helicopters to separate the Viet Cong from the population in the villages while slowly extending government control. The task force would be commanded by Brigadier David Jackson, an experienced infantry officer who had served in the Middle East and New Guinea during the Second World War, and later in the Korean War, and who had commanded the AATTV and Australian Army Force Vietnam prior to taking up the appointment. The command structure that emerged was unique in the Vietnam War. The 1st Australian Task Force at Nui Dat fell under American 2 Field Force Vietnam for operational coordination, but under Australian Force Vietnam Headquarters for national command. Because it came under the operational command of United States 2nd Field Forces Vietnam, but under the national command of Headquarters Australian Forces Vietnam, the commander of 1 ATF had to reconcile sometimes inconsistent objectives. Critically, the Australians maintained the right to fight their own war, their own way within their own province. American generals could advise, they could coordinate, they could request, they could not command the interior of Australian operations. This structure granted commanders significant autonomy in Phuoc Tuy Province, allowing decisions on base security, patrolling, and pacification without direct American micromanagement, though coordination with American forces was required for major operations. Now the Australians built their base. 1 ATF was based in a rubber plantation at Nui Dat, 8 kilometers north of Baria in Phuoc Tuy Province, and consisted of 2 and later 3 infantry battalions with armor, aviation, engineers, and artillery support. They established their defensive perimeter. They began to patrol. And within weeks of their arrival, the full meaning of Australian tactical independence started to become visible to anyone watching closely. The Australian battalion was described as the safest combat force in Vietnam. It was widely felt that the Australians had shown themselves able to give chase to guerrillas without exposing themselves to the lethal ambushes that had claimed so many American dead. Australian patrols shunned jungle tracks and clearings, picking their way carefully and quietly through bamboo thickets and tangled foliage. Patrols took as much as 9 hours to sweep a mile of terrain. They moved forward a few steps at a time, stopped, listened, then proceeded again. 9 hours to sweep a mile. Let that settle. An American unit would cover that same ground in under an hour with a full platoon, helicopters overhead, and radio contact every 15 minutes. The Australian method looked, to American observers, like painful, frustrating, almost willful slowness. To the Australians, it was the only rational approach. In jungle warfare, the first man to make a sound died. The first patrol to be heard was the patrol that got ambushed. Speed in this environment wasn't an advantage. It was an invitation. But the crown jewel of Australian operational philosophy, the element that most fundamentally separated them from American counterparts and most alarmed Viet Cong commanders, was the SAS. Based in Nui Dat, the SASR was responsible for providing intelligence to both the 1st Australian Task Force and American forces, operating throughout Phuoc Tuy Province, as well as Bien Hoa, Long Con, and Binh Thuy provinces. From 1966, SASR squadrons rotated through Vietnam on year-long deployments, with each of the 3 Sabre squadrons completing 2 tours before the last squadron was withdrawn in 1971. Missions included medium-range reconnaissance patrols, observation of enemy troop movements, and long-range offensive operations, and ambushing in enemy-dominated territory. Operating in small groups of 4 to 6 men, they moved more slowly than conventional infantry through jungle or bushland, and were heavily armed, employing a high rate of fire to simulate a larger force on contact and to support their withdrawal. 4 to 6 men, not a platoon, not a company. 4 to 6 men operating for days or weeks inside enemy-controlled territory, moving so slowly that even experienced Viet Cong trackers couldn't follow them, gathering intelligence that could not be obtained any other way. They were so effective in the field that American observers called the Australians ghosts of the jungle. They even provided instructors to the United States Long-Range Reconnaissance Patrol School. Small fire teams of 4 to 6 men moved much more slowly than any other unit, even other special operations units. But once in contact with the enemy, the Australians unleashed a barrage of fire, designed to make the enemy believe there were more men on the opposing side than there really were. The slow, quiet movement and hellish, raking fire the Australians brought to the NVA and VC made them the most feared enemy unit in their areas of South Vietnam. The contrast with American long-range reconnaissance patrol doctrine was significant. American LRRP teams typically operated for shorter periods, maintained more regular radio contact, and were trained to extract immediately upon contact with enemy forces. The philosophy was intelligence first, combat as last resort. Australian SAS philosophy layered both elements differently. They stayed in the field far longer. They gathered intelligence over extended patterns rather than single snapshots. And when they chose to engage, they did so from positions of absolute advantage, ambushes so carefully prepared that the enemy never saw them coming, never knew what had hit them, and frequently couldn't find where the firing had come from after the Australians had already withdrawn. This approach to combat had a dimension that went beyond the tactical. It was deliberately psychological. The D445 Battalion sent tracker teams into areas where SASR activity had been reported. They established listening posts along likely patrol routes and at jungle entry points. Local guides with deep knowledge of the terrain were brought in to help identify where the patrols might be moving. None of it worked. The tracker teams found traces, impressions, the ghost of a patrol route, but the tracks died. They led nowhere. The name took hold naturally. The SAS operated deep behind enemy lines, conducting surveillance at close range, poised to spring into violent action at need. It was with good reason the Viet Cong came to call them Ma Rung, phantoms of the jungle. Then came August 18th, 1966, and the battle that would define Australian Vietnam service for generations. D Company, 6th Battalion Royal Australian Regiment, had gone out on patrol from Nui Dat, following a mortar attack on the base the previous night. They were searching for the enemy's firing positions. They found something considerably larger. When they entered the long tan rubber plantation, the 108 men of Delta Company found themselves engaged in a pitched battle over 3.5 hours with a reinforced main force Viet Cong regiment of approximately 2,000 to 2,500 soldiers. D Company's 105 men and 3 New Zealanders from 161 Battery, Royal New Zealand Artillery, fought for almost 4 hours against soldiers of the North Vietnamese Army, who outnumbered them by 10 to 1. A monsoon rain hammered the plantation. Visibility dropped. Radio aerials were shot away. Ammunition began to run critically low. Ammunition stocks dwindled rapidly, with soldiers depleting their initial load of about 120 rounds per man in the intense fighting, prompting Major Harry Smith to urgently request resupply, as the company risked being overrun. What happened next was distinctly, classically Australian. Artillery from New Zealand guns at Nui Dat thundered onto targets that were sometimes 30 meters from the Australians themselves. Rounds called with pinpoint precision by forward observers, who understood that the alternative was being overrun. Although denied close air support by a tropical thunderstorm, D Company of 6 RAR received supporting artillery fire that at times was directed accurately to within 30 meters of the Australians. A relief force came. Later in the afternoon, a relief force was arranged to move to D Company's aid. First, B Company, which was returning to Nui Dat after their earlier mission, was ordered to turn around and find D Company. Second, permission was granted for the armored personnel carriers of 3 APC troop to move to support D Company. Subsequently, 10 APCs left Nui Dat carrying A Company, 6 RAR. The Australian battle casualties were 18 killed and 24 wounded. Considering the odds those men faced, they acquitted themselves in a way that would ensure their achievement would be remembered in Australian military history forever. Officially, 245 Vietnamese bodies were counted on the battlefield by Australian soldiers. 108 Australians had held against a regiment for nearly 4 hours in pouring rain, called artillery so accurate it landed within arm's reach of their own positions, and driven a force of over 2,000 men from the field. The battle validated every element of Australian tactical doctrine: junior leader initiative, artillery integration practiced to razor sharpness, individual marksmanship, and the willingness to hold ground under conditions that would have collapsed less disciplined forces. Long Tan was significant in that it demonstrated, for the first time in South Vietnam, how quickly 1 ATF units could reconfigure themselves from low-intensity war into the combined arms team needed for high-intensity battle. The Australian and New Zealand victory in the Battle of Long Tan effectively imposed Australian and New Zealand dominance through Phuoc Thai Province for the duration of their presence in Vietnam. But Long Tan was a single day. The real story of Australian success in Phuoc Thai Province was written not in one cataclysmic firefight, but in thousands of smaller operations conducted with grinding patience over 5 years. The Australians drew on their experiences in Malaya and Indonesia to form their strategies. The geography of Phuoc Thai Province influenced their approach. The tactics of the Viet Cong were considered. The commanders decided to send out small patrols. Unlike the American strategy of attrition, which defined no strategic objectives beyond killing large numbers of enemy, 1 ATF's strategy was to disrupt the enemy system of food supply. 1 ATF sent its patrols against the enemy lines of communication and the numerous enemy bunker systems and base camps where most of the enemy's large food reserves were to be found. This was the strategic insight that separated Australian operations most fundamentally from American ones. The Viet Cong in Phuoc Tuy were not a military force hovering in the sky, waiting to be shot down. They were a system, a network of supply lines, food caches, base camps, political infrastructure, and local support that sustained their military capability. You could not bomb that system into submission. You could not sweep through it with large formations and expect the same result twice. The only way to dismantle it was to deprive it of the things it needed to function. And the most critical thing it needed was food. 1 ATF units captured over 1,800 bunker systems and base camps. The average amount of food captured per bunker system and base camp declined each year, to almost nothing by 1970. By mid-1969, the collapse in food supplies stopped the movement of enemy main force units into Phuoc Tuy, and the local guerrilla food organizations could no longer preposition food stocks along the intended route of advance for the main force units. The number of enemy-initiated contacts throughout Phuoc Tuy collapsed, as well as the enemy's effective mining effort. The enemy now only had a token military presence in the province. This was what Australian operational independence had produced, not body count statistics, not daily kill ratios that looked impressive in reports and meant nothing on the ground. A province steadily, measurably being denied to the enemy through patient, persistent operations that gave the Viet Cong no respite and no secure logistics chain. American observers struggled with this. The metrics didn't fit. American commanders in the late 1960s measured progress in Vietnam through quantifiable outputs. Enemy killed, operations conducted, areas swept, tons of ordnance delivered. Australian commanders measured progress differently. They measured it in enemy-initiated contact rates, in the availability of food to hostile forces, in the security of population centers, in the steady contraction of the operational space available to Viet Cong main force units. These were slow measurements. They accumulated across months. They resisted the kind of weekly statistical briefing that American command culture demanded. The friction was constant. This would allow the force greater freedom of action and the chance to demonstrate the Australian Army's evolving concept for counterinsurgency warfare, developed in part from its operations during the Malayan emergency. But demonstrating it to American satisfaction proved difficult when Australian success looked, by American metrics, like inactivity. The Tet Offensive of January 1968 tested Australian independence under maximum pressure. The Communist Tet Offensive began on January 30th, 1968, with the aim of inciting a general uprising, simultaneously engulfing population centers across South Vietnam. In response, one ATF was deployed along likely infiltration routes to defend the vital Bien Hoa Long Binh complex northeast of Saigon as part of Operation Coburg between January and March. The Australians went where they were needed. They fought effectively. But they also came back to Phuoc Tuy, back to their province, back to their war. Then came the battles of Coral and Balmoral, arguably the most intense conventional fighting Australian forces undertook in the entire Vietnam War. In May 1968, 1 RAR and 3 RAR, with armor and artillery, fought off large-scale attacks during the Battle of Coral-Balmoral. 25 Australians were killed and nearly 100 wounded, while the North Vietnamese People's Army of Vietnam lost in excess of 300 killed. At fire support bases Coral and Balmoral, the Australians had clashed with regular People's Army of Vietnam and Viet Cong main force units operating in battalion and regimental strength for the first time in near-conventional warfare, ultimately fighting their largest, most hazardous, and most sustained battle of the war. They fought, they bled, and then they went back to Phuoc Tuy, because that was where their mission was, and because returning to their own operational area rather than being absorbed into extended American operations further afield was the strategic choice that best served both Australian doctrine and Australian resources. The SAS squadrons kept rotating through. 3 Sabre squadrons, each completing 2 tours, moving through Phuoc Tuy and beyond in year-long deployments that built on the intelligence picture their predecessors had established. In a 6-year period, the Australian and New Zealand SAS in Vietnam conducted nearly 1,200 patrols and inflicted heavy casualties on the Viet Cong, including 492 killed, 106 possibly killed, 47 wounded, 10 possibly wounded, and 11 prisoners captured. Their own losses totaled 1 killed in action, 1 died of wounds, 3 accidentally killed, 1 missing, and 1 death from illness. Pause on that. Nearly 1,200 patrols, 492 confirmed enemy killed, against losses of 1 man killed in action. By the end of their time in Vietnam, the unit had performed 1,200 combat patrols, with 1 killed in action, 1 dead from wounds, 3 accidentally killed, 1 missing, and 1 death from illness. That kill ratio is not a product of overwhelming firepower. It is a product of intelligence, patience, positioning, and the willingness to engage only on terms of your own choosing. It is the product of doctrine that treated each patrol as a calculation rather than a demonstration of aggression. American Special Operations Forces were watching, studying, trying to understand how Australian patrols consistently achieved results that American patrols of similar or larger size could not. The SASR soon started operating with American SEAL teams and Special Forces, helping with the American Recondo School, and with MACVSOG missions. The Australians shared what could be shared, but some elements of what they carried into that jungle resisted transfer. The cultural comfort with extended isolation, the psychological resilience required for weeks inside enemy territory without the reassurance of large formations and reliable communications. The fieldcraft that looked simple to describe and proved nearly impossible to replicate without years of training and a very specific selection process. The regiment maintained an impressive record during its operations in Borneo and Vietnam. In these 2 campaigns, over 1,400 patrols were mounted, reporting the movements of over 5,600 enemy troops and accounting for over 500 enemy killed in 298 contacts. The Viet Cong had no rational answer to what the Australians were doing. They tried tracking SAS patrols through territory they knew intimately and found trails that dissolved into nothing. They tried listening posts and local guides and patterns of detection they had used successfully against other forces. Against the Australians, those methods failed consistently, enough that the failure became institutionalized. The name Ma Rung stopped being just a description. It became a tactical warning. Stay out of areas where Australians are operating because you will not see them before they see you, and by the time you hear them, it's already over. Though considered a small component of the free world effort in the war, the troops from Australia and New Zealand were in fact the best trained and prepared for counterinsurgency warfare. That verdict didn't come from Australian historians. It came from researchers examining the record of what actually happened in Phuoc Toi Province between 1966 and 1971 against the record of what happened in comparable areas under American operational control over the same period. The metrics of Australian success in Phuoc Toi weren't soft or ambiguous. Enemy-initiated contacts declined sharply as Australian operations degraded Viet Cong capability. Road security improved along Route 15, the critical supply line from Vung Tau to Saigon. The military objective of securing National Highway 15 to facilitate logistics from Vung Tau Harbor to Saigon and to reduce congestion at the primary port aimed to disrupt enemy supply lines and mobility while establishing a secure lodgment. These were concrete, measurable outcomes achieved not through overwhelming force, but through patient, persistent, intelligence-driven operations that the Australians could only conduct because they were operating under their own command, by their own doctrine, answerable to their own professional judgment. Although one ATF had been able to dominate its area of operations and successfully reduce the PAVN/VC's ability to influence and coerce the population of the province, while affording the South Vietnamese government some degree of control, this did not last following their withdrawal, and PAVN/VC forces began to move back into Phuoc Toi following their departure. And there is the tragedy embedded in the success. The Australians demonstrated that their methods worked. They demonstrated that a brigade-sized force fighting its own war by its own doctrine could achieve a level of counterinsurgency effectiveness that produced measurable security improvements for the population of a contested province. They did this consistently over 5 years, with a fraction of the resources available to their American allies. The security success achieved by one ATF was secured by the counterinsurgency campaign it conducted relentlessly between 1966 and 1971. But it required presence. It required sustained, continuous presence in the jungle, on the trails, inside the enemy's operational space, day and night, week after week, with no gaps that the enemy could use to regroup and rebuild. When that presence ended, when the Australians withdrew as part of the broader Allied disengagement following the Nixon Doctrine, the enemy moved back in, not because the Australians had failed, because the South Vietnamese forces left behind were not ready to sustain what the Australians had built, and because political decisions made in Canberra and Washington had determined the outcome of the war at a level that no amount of tactical excellence could override. Lieutenant General John Wilton had been keen both to field a force that could operate independently of American forces and to provide additional troops in support of the fight against the Viet Cong. Wilton believed that deploying an Australian task force would achieve both these aims, as well as allowing Australian soldiers to fight the war according to their own doctrine and techniques. He was right. The force did achieve those aims. The doctrine worked. And the independence that made the doctrine possible, the operational autonomy that allowed Australians to be slow when Americans were fast, patient when Americans were aggressive, invisible when Americans were loud, was not stubbornness or arrogance. It was the essential precondition for everything that followed. The attachment to American forces had highlighted the differences in operational methods, and Australian and American military leaders subsequently agreed that Australian combat forces should be deployed in a discrete province. That would allow the Australian Army to fight their own tactical war, independently of the United States. 6 words: fight their own tactical war. That is what the first Australian task force did in Phuoc Tuy Province between 1966 and 1971. They fought a patient, grinding, intelligence-driven counterinsurgency campaign that degraded enemy capability to the point where Viet Cong main force units could not operate in the province without being ambushed, tracked, or starved of the supplies they needed to survive. They did it with a force that peaked at around 8,000 personnel against an American commitment that reached more than 500,000. They did it in ways that American doctrine could not replicate, and their results were better than anything comparable American operations produced in similar terrain against similar forces. During their time in Vietnam, the SASR proved highly successful, with members of the regiment known to the Viet Cong as Ma Rong, or Phantoms of the Jungle, due to their stealth. That name, given not by allies, not by historians, not by the government officials who would later commission memorials and issue medals, given by the enemy, by the men in the jungle who had spent years trying to find those Australian patrols and couldn't, who had sent their best trackers in and watched them come back empty-handed or not come back at all, who had learned through hard experience that engaging Australians on their terms in their chosen terrain was a losing proposition, who gave them a name that meant something beyond tactical respect, something that acknowledged a kind of presence in the jungle that went beyond the conventional, beyond what doctrine and manuals and training schools could produce, something that had to be earned, one silent, patient, invisible patrol at a time, across 6 years of unbroken operations in one of the most unforgiving environments on Earth. The refusal of Australian forces to subordinate themselves completely to American command in Vietnam was not rebellion. It was not a diplomatic incident dressed in military language. It was a professional army's insistence on fighting the way it knew how to fight, using the doctrine it had developed through real experience, preserving the operational culture that made its soldiers what they were. And the record of that insistence, written in captured food caches and declining contact rates and enemy nicknames, and a kill ratio that American commanders spent years trying to explain, is one of the clearest demonstrations in modern military history that small forces can achieve strategic effects far beyond their size, but only when they are permitted to be exactly what they are, rather than shaped into imperfect copies of someone larger. The jungle ghosts of Phuoc Tuy province followed no one else's orders. They followed a doctrine built from Malaya and Borneo, and decades of institutional learning that the United States Army had not yet lived long enough to possess. They were patient when patience was required, and violent when violence was required, and the Viet Cong, who knew that jungle better than anyone, called them phantoms, not because they were supernatural, because they were simply that good. And they were that good because they were allowed to be themselves. That is why they refused to follow orders, not out of pride, out of the absolute professional certainty that following those orders would have made them something less than what they were. And in this war, in this jungle, anything less than what they were would not have been enough.